The engagement dinner was held in the private room of a quiet restaurant downtown. The kind of place where the lighting is warm enough to flatter everyone, and the air conditioning hums softly above the conversation. My sister stood near the center of the room, holding a glass of champagne while relatives settled into their chairs. Plates clicked softly as the staff arranged the appetizers. I had arrived early, mostly out of habit. In my family, arriving early meant you helped set things up. That role had settled onto me years ago. My mother, Linda, looked across the table and lifted her hand slightly. "Emily, since you're already standing, you might as well help the staff and pass the drinks around," she said, her tone light but carrying across the table. "You've always been better with small tasks than big decisions." A few people chuckled politely. My cousin leaned toward someone beside him and said just loudly enough to be heard, "He's always good with the small stuff." Another small wave of laughter followed. I nodded and picked up the tray the server had left on the side table. The glasses touched lightly against one another as I carried them across the room. No one said anything else about it. They didn't need to. In families like mine, roles rarely require explanation. I placed the final glass near the head of the table where Uncle Robert was sitting. My mother gave a quick satisfied nod and returned to her conversation. The air conditioner hummed above us, steady and indifferent. They didn't realize something had already changed. Being underestimated rarely arrives as an insult. More often, it appears as convenience. People begin to rely on you for quiet tasks. They assume you will organize things, solve small problems, answer emails, fix schedules, and remember details. And eventually those roles become permanent in their minds. Not because anyone announced it, but because it never seemed necessary to question it. For years I had occupied that space inside my family. Dependable, reasonable, quiet. If you have ever been the person everyone trusts with the practical details but rarely the decisions, you probably understand the feeling I'm describing. Not resentment, just a certain kind of invisibility. If that kind of quiet resilience sounds familiar, you might consider subscribing. And if you've ever been underestimated in your own family or workplace, I'm curious how it happened for you. You can mention it in the comments. Because stories like this rarely begin with dramatic confrontations. They begin with assumptions. And in my family, those assumptions had been stable for a long time. Until recently. Today wasn't like the others. My family had always organized itself around one simple structure. The loudest voice usually belonged to the person with the most financial authority. In this case, that person was my Uncle Robert. He had taken over the family company after my grandfather retired 15 years earlier. Technically, the business still belonged to several members of the family. Shares had been distributed over time, mostly through inheritance. But day-to-day control rested with him. He spoke at gatherings. He announced decisions. He described the company's direction using phrases like long-term stability and experienced leadership. Most relatives accepted that arrangement without question. My father preferred to avoid business discussions entirely. My aunt trusted Raj's judgment. My sister had never been particularly interested in the company. And me. I was the reliable one. The one who handled practical things when needed. If paperwork appeared at a family event, someone passed it toward me. If travel plans needed coordinating, I was asked to organize them. Those habits formed gradually. I remember one dinner years ago when my uncle handed me a folder and said, "You're good with details. Can you review these vendor invoices?" Everyone returned to their conversation while I read through the pages. No one thought much about it. Another time my aunt asked if I could quickly fix an issue with the company's document storage system after dinner. I stayed up late reorganizing digital records while everyone else watched a movie in the living room. Again, nothing dramatic happened. The system simply worked. They spoke. I handled the mechanics behind the scenes. Eventually that pattern stopped feeling temporary. They assumed compliance was permanent. What my family considered small administrative tasks gradually expanded into something larger. Someone needed to maintain vendor contacts. Someone needed to keep track of board meeting schedules. Someone needed to organize the legal documents that accumulated over time, contracts, amendments, share certificates, trust records. Those tasks drifted toward me mostly because I never complained about them. I built a digital archive for the company's paperwork. I scheduled reminder systems for renewal dates and governance filings. When lawyers sent updated drafts of agreements, I was usually the person who saved the files in the appropriate folders. From the outside, none of this looked particularly important. It resembled clerical work. Even my uncle described it that way once. "Emily keeps our paperwork organized. he said casually during a meeting call. He's very reliable with that kind of thing. What he didn't realize was that documentation tells a story when you read enough of it. Board structures, voting thresholds, share distributions, authority chains for financial approvals. Those details sit quietly inside contracts and bylaws until someone pays attention to them. Over the years, I became familiar with how the company actually functioned beneath the surface language used at family gatherings. Not because anyone formally explained it to me. Because access accumulates knowledge. And knowledge eventually clarifies where authority truly rests. Access teaches you what authority often ignores. 2 weeks before my sister's engagement dinner, a routine message arrived from the firm that handled the company's governance documents. The email concerned an administrative update to one of the family trusts that held a portion of the company's shares. Ordinarily, those messages were simple reminders to review paperwork. But this one referenced an amendment related to my grandfather's original estate plan. When I opened the attached document, I noticed something that had been easy to overlook. Years earlier, my grandfather had created a conditional transfer clause inside one of the trusts. It allowed a redistribution of voting shares under a specific circumstance, if a designated trustee confirmed that the company's operational management and ownership structure had diverged beyond a certain threshold. In simpler terms, the clause existed to prevent permanent control by someone who did not actually hold majority ownership. The trustee named in the document was not a family member. It was the law firm itself, and the clause required only 2 confirmations. First, documentation showing the current share distribution. Second, confirmation from the trustee that the clause should activate according to the original estate instructions. Over the years, small transfers and inheritance adjustments had gradually shifted ownership percentages among family members. No one had recalculated the voting structure carefully, except the law firm, apparently. Their message asked whether the family intended to proceed with the activation review outlined in the trust. I responded the way I always handled administrative correspondence. Calmly, factually. I confirmed the share records they already possessed and forwarded the updated documentation stored in our archive. 3 days later, the trustee finalized the amendment and redistributed the voting control exactly as the original trust required. The change did not remove anyone's shares. It simply aligned voting authority with actual ownership, which meant one person now held majority control. Meh. By the time we gathered that evening, the structure had already changed. Back at the engagement dinner, the appetizers had mostly disappeared and the staff began clearing plates. My sister sat beside her fiancé while relatives raised glasses to celebrate the announcement. Eventually, Uncle Robert stood to speak. He had always been comfortable addressing a room. Family businesses depend on steady hands, he began, holding his glass lightly. Experience matters. Responsibility matters. Several people nodded. He spoke about legacy, about the importance of protecting what previous generations had built. The language sounded familiar. Toward the end of the speech, he glanced briefly in my direction. And of course, he added with a small smile, younger members of the family will eventually find their place in the company. Another polite ripple of laughter moved through the room. But leadership requires patience, he continued. There's a difference between helping with tasks and carrying responsibility. The comment wasn't aggressive. It was simply confident. The kind of statement people accept without examining too closely. A few relatives looked toward me briefly, then back to him. I remained where I was near the side of the table. He finished his drink and placed the glass down. Anyway, he said, relaxing his posture, that's enough from me. He looked around the room. Does anyone want to add something? He asked if anyone wanted to add something. For a moment no one spoke. I set the tray I had been holding back onto the side table. There is one small update, I said. The tone of the room didn't change immediately. People assumed I was going to mention something logistical about the evening. Earlier this week, the trustee of grandfather's estate finalized a review of the share distribution inside the family trust, I continued. My uncle's expression remained polite. I could see him waiting for the practical point of the comment. The review activated Clause 14 of the original trust agreement, I said. Someone at the far end of the table stopped cutting their dessert. That clause aligns voting authority with current ownership percentages, I added. My uncle's hand paused slightly on the table. The trustee completed the adjustment on Thursday, I said. The updated records were filed the same afternoon. No one interrupted. According to the revised governance structure, I finished. Majority voting control now sits with my shares. The room remained quiet. I didn't add anything else. There was no speech. Just the factual update. Someone lowered their glass slowly onto the table. Silence behaves differently in a crowded room. At first it appears as a pause in conversation. Then it begins to stretch. My cousin glanced at his phone, likely searching for something related to the company records. Two relatives leaned closer together and whispered briefly. Across the table my aunt looked from me to my uncle and back again, as if recalculating a conversation she thought she understood. My uncle maintained his posture carefully. Years of business meetings had probably taught him how to remain composed when information changed unexpectedly. I wasn't aware the trustee had completed that review, he said finally. His voice was calm. The documents were circulated through the governance archive, I replied. The law firm confirmed receipt this morning. Another quiet moment followed. Someone near the center of the table opened their email on a phone. I could hear the faint tapping of a screen being scrolled. Gradually the room shifted from celebration to quiet evaluation. Not dramatic panic. Just adjustment. People were mentally rearranging the structure they had assumed existed. My uncle nodded once. He reached for his water glass and took a slow sip. Then he placed the glass back on the table. A few minutes later he approached me near the doorway. "Emily," he said quietly, "could we speak for a moment?" His tone remained controlled. We stepped into the hallway outside the dining room where the lighting was slightly brighter. "I'd like to review those documents with you," he said. "Of course," I replied. He studied my expression carefully. "The trustee must have interpreted the clause differently than expected," he continued. "Possibly," I said. "But the language is fairly specific." He nodded slowly. "Even so," he said, "decisions like this usually involve discussion." "The trust authorizes the trustee to proceed once the criteria are confirmed," I said. Again he paused. Not frustrated. Just measuring the situation. "Well," he said finally, "we'll need to coordinate moving forward." "I agree," I said. And for the first time in years the word coordinate carried a slightly different meaning between us. Later that night I sent a short series of emails from my laptop. One confirmed the trustee's update to the board distribution list. Another requested that the accounting firm redirect approval notifications through the revised majority contact. The law firm acknowledged the governance adjustment within an hour. They attached the finalized documents and updated the company's official records accordingly. None of the messages contained emotional language. They simply documented the structural reality that already existed. Vendor accounts updated their authorization settings the following morning. Board meeting notices were automatically routed through the revised control structure. Within 24 hours the company's internal systems reflected the change quietly and completely. Back at the restaurant the celebration continued in a more subdued tone. People eventually returned to discussing the engagement and the upcoming wedding plans. I finished my glass of water and placed the napkin neatly beside the plate. My sister was laughing with her fiancé near the center of the table. I collected my coat from the chair near the wall. No one asked where I was going. The door to the dining room closed softly behind me as I stepped into the hallway. I didn't need the microphone. Authority often appears louder than it actually is. People associate it with speeches, announcements, and visible confidence. But structural authority behaves differently. It sits quietly inside documents, voting rights, and procedural systems. It does not need to convince anyone in the moment. It simply exists once the records reflect it. For years my role in the family had been defined by visibility at the edges of conversations. Helpful. Reliable. Not central. What most people didn't notice was that proximity to the administrative details gradually reveals the architecture behind public authority. Who signs what? Who approves what? Which clauses activate under specific conditions? Once those mechanics become clear, the difference between appearance and control becomes easier to see. Underestimation creates a certain kind of freedom. People stop watching closely. They assume the structure around them is permanent. Sometimes it is. Sometimes it simply hasn't been reviewed carefully in a while. Either way, authority rarely changes through dramatic confrontation. More often it changes through documentation. A clause activated. A record updated. A governance file amended. Control doesn't announce itself. It simply updates the record.